If you've been following this channel for a while, you'll probably agree that Narnian lore is actually pretty amazing. The symbolism runs deeper than you could have imagined, and the world building is much more coherent and consistent than it might seem at first glance. But if I'm honest about it, there's one thing that's been bugging me about the Narnian universe for years, and chances are it's probably bothered you too. It's the problem of technology. You see, Narnian tech seems to appear out of nowhere. And even worse, it seems like it's eternally stuck in the medieval era of our world. Now, after a few thousand years of Narnian history, wouldn't you expect to see Narnia turn into something like our modern world? It seems like a problem, right? Well, I've done a deep dive, and from what I've discovered, I think the answer might surprise you. Now, we are going to dive in deep today, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Boyce College. You know, the future doesn't change much in Narnia, but in our world, it is coming on at a rapid pace. And that's why today's college students need to prepare to be future ready. And Boyce College knows that predicting what work will look like in a world inundated with change is impossible, but preparing for that world is not. Students who build their college experience on the foundations of eternal truths will be faithfully equipped for whatever comes next. Boyce College exists to train, educate, and prepare students to serve Christ faithfully throughout the entirety of their lives, no matter where God calls them. Now, those goals are accomplished by focusing on 3 educational outcomes for every graduate: keeping faith first, becoming future ready, and growing kingdom focused. Now, to learn how keeping faith first produces graduates who are future ready and kingdom focused, please go to boycecollege.com/faith. And a big thank you to all the Patreon supporters out there who made today's episode possible. You all have created such a special community, and I'm so thankful for your support, especially during this season. So thanks again. Well, let's go ahead and get started. It's time to leave the Shadowlands behind and step into a world that's more real than our own. It's time to follow me into the wardrobe. When you start to take stock of the tech in Narnia, a few things come to mind. First of all, there's obviously the technology of war. Swords and armor, bows and arrows, shields and chariots. And then there's the advanced architecture and construction techniques in places like Cair Paravel and the city of Tashbaan. And there's also the knowledge of shipbuilding and transoceanic navigation with ships like the Splendor Highland and the Dawn Treader. And there's even the printing press. And you know, all of these fit fairly well in the category of medieval technology. But then there are some pieces of tech that seem to stand out like a sore thumb. For instance, the fireworks when Miraz's son was born in Prince Caspian, or the various scientific instruments like the astrolabe on the island of the magician Corican. And then there's the really odd stuff like Mrs. Beaver's spectacles or the iron stove and sewing machine that looks like it was lifted right out of the 1800s. Now, I have so many questions about this. For starters, how did Narnian tech develop so quickly in the first place? And secondly, why did it get stuck in the medieval era? And finally, where did these really weird advanced things come from? Now, to answer these questions, I'm going to work hard to avoid the literal Deus Ex Machina trick that might give us some cheap and easy answers unless the lore tells us otherwise. So, no, we won't just say, oh, well, Father Christmas brought them or Aslan taught them how to do it. But there will be some extra worldly answers to some of these questions, as you'll soon see. So, first question, how did Narnian tech develop? Well, first and foremost, unlike some might assume about our world, incorrectly I might say, Narnian knowledge didn't start from zero. Many of the Narnian creatures were actually created with intelligence, with proclivities and talents according to their species. For example, centaurs were imbibed with a knowledge of the stars, and fauns were blessed with the gift of music, and dwarves were inherently miners and craftsmen. You actually see this at the very beginning of the creation of Narnia, when the dwarves forged the crowns of King Frank and Queen Helen out of gold all by themselves. So, on day one of Narnia, dwarves could have begun mining and crafting most of the medieval tools and weapons of war that we see in Narnia. In many legends, dwarves were also master builders and masons. So, much of the stone-based architecture could have been built by dwarves, with the help of giants and other strong creatures. Now, there's also the knowledge that Jadis brought from Charn, but there's real reason to believe that her influence on Narnian technology was actually minimal. It's too much to get into here, but I'll just say that some of the factors might include her banishment, Charn's technological status during her lifetime, Aslan's intervention at certain places in the Narnian timeline, and her dependence on magic. Now, another very important factor is the fact that the first king and queen were actually humans from our world, from the late 19th century. That means that they brought with them into Narnia all of the knowledge and experience of their world, including any hints and ideas and inspiration of the world technology up to that point. As a cabbie, Frank would have had knowledge of leatherwork to maintain Strawberry's harnesses, mechanical and carpentry skills to maintain his cab, and maybe even some smithing experience himself, assuming that he shoot his own horses. And as for Queen Helen, although we don't know much about her, we do know that she came from the country to London, and that most likely means that she was poor. In the 19th century England, most poor women had no choice but to work, and one of the largest employers of women were the London textile factories. So she may have brought her knowledge and experience as a fabric maker or weaver or seamstress to Narnia on day one. Now, there's no doubt that for King Frank and Queen Helen, Narnia was a much more beautiful place than dirty industrial London in the 1900s. And so you might speculate that even though they may have had knowledge of industrial technology, they may have refrained from sharing that with the Narnians in order to not spoil the beautiful country that they were now living in. So as you can see, Narnian tech really didn't need millennia to develop. It got a pretty good jump start on day one. Now that answers the first question, but now we have to ask ourselves, why did Narnian tech seem to progress? Well, there are really three plausible ways to look at this, but the first thing we need to consider is why should we even expect technology to develop over time in the first place? I mean, in our day and age, we are witnessing the most rapid development of technology in human history. And to us, this insanely fast advancement of knowledge is almost normal. But it hasn't always been that way. Some of you may be familiar with the futurist and inventor Ray Kurzweil, who famously explained in his book, The Singularity is Near, that human technological advancement isn't a straight line, it's a logarithmic curve. And so each milestone of technology empowers the next, so that new milestones happen faster and faster. So while us modern folks are used to advancements that are year to year or even month to month at this point, early milestones in human history took literally millennia. I mean, practically speaking, there really wasn't that much technological difference between the beginning of the classical antiquity and the end of the medieval period. I mean, some would even argue that ancient Rome was even more technologically advanced than medieval Europe. The point is, even in our world, there are times when not much changes, even over a period of a few thousand years. And then there's the next point, magic in Narnia. Narnia was filled with magical and supernatural beings, including witches and sorcerers, nymphs and fairies, mythical gods and heroes, and even fallen stars. And as a result, the usefulness of magic may have slowed down the need for scientific discovery. Now, in our world, it seems like science has dimmed the light of magic, and in Narnia, the opposite may have been true. And finally, there's the loss of knowledge that Narnia experienced during times of national and global crisis. Mraz's Telmarines famously avoided the sea, and as a result, the knowledge of shipbuilding was lost. The Dawn Treader was actually rudimentary compared to the ancient ship, the Splendor Highlene. And don't forget the 100-year winter. By the time we actually catch our first glimpse of Narnia in 1000 MT, how much knowledge had actually been lost after a century of isolation and oppression? So to sum it all up, is it unbelievable or even implausible that Narnian tech didn't advance much over its 2,300-year history? Well, not at all. In fact, it probably makes the most sense. Now, let's talk about those bits of tech that seem to stand out. Remember, things like cuckoo clocks and spectacles and fireworks and sewing machines. Where did they all come from? Well, one thing that I will note is that in our world, most of these actually are around even in the medieval late period. But remember, so far, most of the medieval-like tech in Narnia was actually created by Narnians as part of their natural skill sets. So what about these things? Well, I believe that you can trace each one of those items to visitors from our world. Let's take, for example, the clocks and the spectacles. You know, in The Magician's Nephew, we're told about a golden tree that springs up from the ground after some coins fell out of Uncle Andrew's pocket when he was turned upside down. Now, the dwarves actually made Frank and Helen's crowns out of the gold from this tree. What if maybe, just maybe, Uncle Andrew happened to be carrying a pocket watch in his pocket, and that also fell out? Now, watch gears might be tricky for dwarves to reproduce, but they could certainly scale up the technology and make some incredible clocks. And being a proper and aging English gentleman of the day, he probably carried around a monocle, something that easily could have been studied and developed into technology like magnifying glasses or Mr. Beaver's spectacles. And the fireworks and the astrolabes? Well, those are common nautical tools, very similar to the items that would have been used in our world by telemarines who discovered Narnia. Maybe they brought along some flares and their navigation tool as they explored their newfound world. And finally, what about the stove and the sewing machine? Well, regardless of how much King Frank and Queen Helen loved their new home in Narnia and wanted to preserve its natural beauty, I like to think that there were a few creature comforts that Queen Helen just couldn't live without. Now, it wouldn't be such a stretch to imagine that she spent a good deal of time describing the design of her royal stove and sewing machine to those crafty dwarves, would it? Of course, these are all just theories. But it just goes to show you that Narnian lore, it holds up far better than some people might imagine. And the low-tech world of Narnia, well, it reminds us that when it comes to our modern world with its modern technology, all the entertainment, all the comforts, all the security, all the noise. And in the end, that's just what it is. Noise. It's a distraction from what really matters, from what really makes us live life to the fullest. So maybe when this video ends, after you like and subscribe, of course, well, maybe you put the screen down. Maybe take a walk outside. Spend some time with creation. And while you're at it, spend some time with the Creator.